Hello and welcome. We wish you and yours a very happy Shri Krishna Janmashtami. Our top story today is this 3-hour-long meeting between US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin at the joint base at Anchorage, Alaska. That meeting that lasted 3 hours. So there was no deal, but both sides described the meeting as constructive, positive, and forward-looking. So there is forward movement. But who walked away with what from this meeting? President Trump rolled out the red carpet for President Putin, treating him as an honored guest. Clearly, the American media says President Putin has walked away victorious, but analysts, including John Bolton, say that President Trump did not lose either. So what did Russia get out of this? What did the United States achieve? And is the only loser Ukraine in all of this? How is the rest of Europe reacting to this? I'm Gaurav Sawant. We decode at length, but let me get you some of the broad points that were made both by the American president and by the Russian president. The two aircraft, they landed one after the other. President Trump walked out of his aircraft. President Putin walked out of his aircraft. Then they met at the center of the red carpet, got a picture together, drove, as the American media describes them, the beast besties. As in the American president's beast in his limousine, the American president and the Russian president drove together. They were on first-name basis. At least the American president addressed President Putin as Vladimir several times. But the Russian president also was emphatic in his praise. He called President Trump a dear friend, called the two countries close neighbors that were separated only by the Strait of Bering. The distance between Russia and America in Alaska, in that region, is barely a couple of kilometers divided by that ocean, divided by the Strait of Bering. So he said, had President Trump remained the president of the United States of America, the war with Ukraine would not have taken place at all. What else was said? Take a look.
So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So we also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe, thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job.
I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere.
И вот сегодня мы слышим, когда президент Трамп говорит, что если бы я был президентом, то войны бы не было. Я думаю, что так бы на самом деле и случилось. Я подтверждаю это, потому что в целом у нас с президентом Трампом наладился очень хороший деловой и доверительный контакт. И у меня есть все основания полагать, что, двигаясь по этому пути, мы можем дойти и чем быстрее, тем лучше, до завершения конфликта на Украине. Благодарю вас за внимание.
One of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress.
That's a very major statement that was made by Russia's President Vladimir Putin. We hope that things will move forward in a constructive, positive environment and that there will be no backroom dealings in European capitals. So he knows what may happen. He knows that there are powers out there to sabotage the peace process like they did with the initiative that was taken in Turkey earlier. But is this a big win for President Putin? There are several analysts in the United States of America who say President Trump did not lose, but it is a big victory for President Putin. Why? Look at those images on your television screen, that red carpet that was rolled out for the Russian president. Legitimacy on the world stage. That criticism over several years that he's now a global pariah, that nobody's dealing with him, that clearly is not true. He's on the world stage with the US president, the red carpet rolled out for him, a B-2 bomber flanked by F-35 fighter jets give him a fly past, red carpet, personal welcome by President Trump. There's a rise in international standing, no doubt. Also, a no deal. No deal also means there's no check on the current situation on ground, no ceasefire. It also indicates that he's managed to persevere. Russia's stance, what is he saying? President Putin is constantly saying, address Russia's core concerns, the root concerns first. So he's managed, of course, with President Trump of the United States of America to ensure that the ball now is in President Zelensky's court to take the peace process forward. And what would that indicate is the big question. And I want to bring in our guests on this special broadcast to talk more about this. My colleague Pranay Upadhyay with me on the story. Also joining me on this special broadcast is Niranjan Marjani, a foreign affairs analyst who's been tracking this closely. But Pranay, big win. Analysts in America say for President Putin, no ceasefire, didn't see it an inch, and insisted on Russia's root causes. That's the point, he says, they must be addressed first.
Absolutely, Gaurav. And if you see the key takeaways for President Putin here, he got almost like a state visit kind of a welcome. Red carpet was rolled for his welcome in Alaska. Besides that, he had a good meeting. President Donald Trump himself said it's a 10 on 10. So that is a big thing. Also, if you see, besides this official engagement, he did visit an Orthodox church there. He did go to the Soviet, fallen Soviet soldiers memorial there, and he appreciated the U.S. government for the upkeep of that memorial. So obviously, it was like a good state visit there, and obviously, Europe and Ukraine, maybe, they might be expressing their dismay over this meeting because nothing happened in terms of the concession, putting up pressure. They might have had expectations that, President Trump would pressurize Vladimir Putin to concede on his, demands and compel Russia to announce some kind of a ceasefire. That didn't happen. So definitely there are certain words of caution coming from the European capitals.
Okay.
We are yet to see that what will happen when President Trump reach out to the European capitals and President Zelensky. That call didn't happen as yet.
So
but,
let's take a look at the developments that have taken place so far. Ambassador Veena Sikri, former top diplomat, joins us on this special broadcast. Also, I want to welcome Dr. Harinder Sekho from the Vivekanand International Foundation joining us. Welcome, Ambassador Sikri. Your appreciation, how do you see the developments that are taking place? John Bolton said it's a victory for President Putin, though not a defeat for President Trump.
Well, I think that, yesterday when we were talking about this, we did think that ceasefire would be a very good outcome. But it hasn't happened. But the body language, especially the statements coming from President Trump, show that he is not dissatisfied with the outcome. He's calling it productive. He called it a 10 on 10, as has already been noted. So I think that he is happy that he started the process of dialogue. Now, let's see what are President Putin's strongest points. A, the commitment on no movement of Ukraine to join NATO. That's a very big point. And the second point is, of course, about the territories, about the swap of the territories. Now, on these 2 points, it is quite clear that President Putin has not given in, and he has outlined these as his red lines. But what he has said about it, whether there's going to be a partial swap, whether it is all the 4 provinces or just 2 provinces, all that is not known. There is known that President Trump will now talk to the European leaders and to President Zelensky. It is important for the European leaders to put pressure on President Zelensky to agree to the conditions for a ceasefire. And I think that from President Trump's body language and from his statement, it does seem that A, he's expecting a positive outcome in his talks with the European leaders and with President Zelensky. And 2, he is looking forward to a fairly quick resumed meeting with President Putin, perhaps even in Moscow. So I think that the body language and the statements that have come out of it, we saw President Putin's very clear statement. That also was not despondent. It was very a warm statement, a happy statement. And, the way that they met on the red carpet and the way that they were welcomed, and they both took off almost simultaneously from Anchorage after the meeting. I think the next 4 hours are crucial. Let us see what happens. And President Trump, as you said, let us see, because, we had these horrible statements by his senior cabinet colleagues about putting additional tariff on India if the talks don't go well. But I don't think he has concluded, President Trump does not seem to have concluded that the talks have not gone well. He said, yes.
I'll come to India and the additional tariffs in just a moment. But for the first part of our conversation, Dr. Sekho, I want to remain on some of what was said both by President Putin and by President Trump. So President Trump now, he does say progress has been made, but he says there's no deal till there's a deal. I believe we had very productive meeting. Many points were agreed on, but complex. A couple of big points, we haven't quite gotten there. We've made headway. So no details. He's talking in generalities. That perhaps shows how complicated this dialogue is. But in the way you see it, is the onus now on President Zelensky of Ukraine to take this process forward? What will bring about a ceasefire in your view?
Unfortunately, the ceasefire, which we thought would be a given, Putin has not agreed to that. And Trump may sound very happy with the outcome. It is a relatively good outcome in the sense that they've both agreed to meet further and speak. But what Trump says and what is reality, we have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Because if you listen in to people in Moscow, they feel that Putin has gained legitimacy and he has come out stronger from this meeting. And he has not let go on his red flags, that is the ceasefire and ceding territory.
Yes.
And as they were speaking, Zelensky made a statement that the killings in Ukraine are still going on. So that is not a very happy, comfortable state of affairs. But they've agreed, and this puts a lot of pressure on Zelensky because he also has his domestic constituency to address and the parliament. I mean, he has to go to parliament. And if the parliament does not approve of the deal, it becomes a total deal breaker.
Except that parliament is way past its tenure, and that's another legitimate point that President Putin has raised, that this parliament has completed its tenure, this president has completed its tenure. Absolutely. Whenever elections are held, whenever the new president and the new parliament come in place, they may just throw out any agreement that's put in place out of the window because there is no legitimacy of this leadership in Ukraine. But Niranjan Marjani, before I come to that point for elaboration in greater detail, what is President Putin saying? Root cause needs to be eliminated. All legitimate Russian concerns must be addressed and taken into account. And there has to be a fair balance in security sphere in Europe. And this fair balance is something that Europe, Ukraine, and Russia just don't agree on. So are we back to square one?
I think what President Putin is saying is, of course, about NATO's eastward expansion, and he wants a guarantee that NATO would not expand eastwards and would not add any more members, and particularly would not make Ukraine a part of NATO. That is what he has been saying about Russia's security concerns, and which need to be addressed by European countries as well as America. That is what I understand from what President Putin spoke when he spoke to President Trump during his meeting said. But having said that, I think it would have been a mistake to expect any solution or any ceasefire from this meeting, because right from the start, I personally do not believe that it had got anything to do with Ukraine, because Ukraine was not invited. It was just a meeting between US and Russia, and if anything, it did grant President Putin legitimacy, and particularly the way the Western countries have been, avoiding contact with Russia, or like Russia
Yes.
has been a pariah in international on international stage. Now I think Putin does have legitimacy to engage with US as well as other Western nations.
So
At the same time,
engagement with the US has already taken place, Ambassador Sikri. The way you have seen Europe react in the past, especially since 2022, will Europe, whether it's Germany or France or the United Kingdom, will they have to furiously backpedal, or will they continue to arm Ukraine? And can they afford to arm Ukraine without the United States of America? Because President Trump yesterday made it very clear, while he loves that big, beautiful check that he was getting from NATO for selling weapons to Ukraine, he wanted peace. He wanted loss of lives to stop.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Gaurav. The key factor now is the extent to which President Trump can persuade the European leaders, put pressure on them to come along with a ceasefire, because it seems, as a broad outcome of the meeting, that the outlines of a deal seem to be on the cards. Something has been agreed to on the cards, but it could not be, there's no use announcing it right now at the Anchorage summit if immediately the European leaders are going to oppose it and say, no, 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 we don't agree, and this is all unacceptable, etc. That would be very, very embarrassing for President Trump. So now, if indeed President Trump and President Putin have agreed to the outlines of a possible solution, beginning perhaps with a ceasefire, he must get the European leaders on board. If he does that, they will be able to put pressure on President Zelensky to also come on board. And of course, there's a very key factor that President Zelensky is really not legitimate anymore, because he hasn't held elections and there's no parliament that he can go back to for any kind of approval. So the key is now, I think, the next 24 hours, when President Trump is going to be having these telephonic conversations with, I'm sure, the Prime Minister of the UK, with the Chancellor of Germany, and President Macron,
Yes.
others. And will President Zelensky come on board? President Zelensky will come on board if the European leaders agree, because the European leaders are in fact the only, shall I say, block between a final agreement on the ceasefire and President Zelensky agreeing to it.
Okay.
If the European leaders are with President Trump, that's it. The ceasefire is done.
President Trump, by all indications, Dr. Sekho, has indicated that when journalists, put that question to him, will US give that security guarantee that Ukraine so desperately seeks? He said yes with Europe, but not in the NATO format. So, on board Air Force One, that conversation was taking place. So, is that very clear? No NATO format security, some kind of a security guarantee, but then that would also have to take into account Russia's concerns that to demilitarize Ukraine is a maximalist position, but the number of soldiers and the kind of weapons they have will have to be put in check.
Absolutely, Gaurav. The NATO enlargement has been at the forefront of Putin's core concerns, not since today, but even in 2014 when he annexed Crimea. So now he's very clear that it's one of the key points that he is against Ukraine being given NATO membership ever. And this is something which the NATO powers and the Europeans would need to agree to. But some kind of a guarantee, because Zelensky, he may not be legitimate or whatever, but he is the president who is negotiating right now. And he would need to, he is accountable to his people who elected him. And he cannot wish away Ukraine's security guarantees. So it has to be something, I feel it's going to be something which Putin will first have to agree to. And maybe the US would try to put certain mechanisms in consultation with Russia to ensure that there is either I can't foresee into the future, but there's going to be a no first attack or something like that, because the pressure really is on Ukraine at this time, because ever since, the last few months we've seen Russia has made rapid advances and is annexing territory. So the territorial exchange or return of territories is going to be the other contentious issue. And along with that, some guarantee would have to be given to Ukraine, because otherwise, what peace are we talking about?
And you cannot have a permanent LOC kind of a situation like you have between India and Pakistan, because that would be a festering wound, Niranjan Marjani. You look at the situation on ground right now, even now forces before the ceasefire are inching forward from the Russian side, hoping to maximize their gains. And indications from the Russian side are their core concerns: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye. There is no relenting on that. Kherson, we do not still know whether that could be used as a bargaining chip, but Russia is hoping to maximize its position as much as it can. They want to maximize it.
Yes, definitely. And Russia has been making very rapid advances since last few weeks we have seen. And of course, if there are talks again between, say, USA and Russia, or maybe including European countries and Ukraine, then Putin would certainly like to strengthen his position by gaining maximum territory. Whether or not he will agree to exchange the territory during peace talks, that remains uncertain. And I find it difficult that Putin will agree to any territorial exchange. Also, the thing is, if he does not agree to any ceding territory that Russia has gained, then again, I think there won't be any peace, and I don't think this issue will be resolved, because then European nations would again feel threatened with Russia's advances, and Ukraine would again look forward to guarantee.
But so there is a step forward. Both sides are saying it's a step that's been taken. The environment is positive. Constructive is the approach. The next meeting, will it take place in Moscow? Will it be a trilateral? Russia, Ukraine, and the United States of America. Professor Latham, your appreciation of the meeting. You agree with John Bolton. President Putin won, though President Trump did not lose. Key takeaway according to you, sir?
Well, I think that's an apt way of characterizing it. Putin certainly won in the sense that he got literally and metaphorically the red carpet treatment. He's back at the center of the international community, in his own mind at least, and he certainly was treated that way. There was a lot of bonhomie between the two, and compliments were exchanged, and he looked like a world leader, not the isolated warmonger that he has been made out to be in certain quarters around the world. So in that sense, Putin definitely won. He also won in that he played defense very well. He didn't give anything up. He kept talking about the root causes of the war in Ukraine, and no ceasefire was possible until these were addressed. These are long-standing red lines for Putin, and he didn't back off them one little bit. He seems physically incapable of smiling, but again, metaphorically, he was smiling throughout this thing. He was on his best behavior. He looked like a statesman. He looked like the leader of a great power. That's a win for him. Trump, on the other hand, looked like what he is, which is a deal maker. He, again, emanated this very positive, gave off this very positive vibe. But when you listen to them carefully, they said almost nothing. Generalities and vague aspirations, nice words, but no details. And then Trump dropped the big bomb at the end, near the end, when he said, well, of course, there was one big issue that we couldn't agree on. Well, gee, I wonder what that big issue was. Yep. It's clearly Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. A while back, I would have said that Donald Trump would have rolled over because he's not very interested in Ukraine. He's not very invested, again, literally or metaphorically, in Ukraine. And I don't think he cares very much. But he's under a great deal of pressure from American partners and allies. Prime Minister Starmer in the UK and Chancellor Merz in Germany and President Macron in France and others. And they are insisting that Zelensky has a seat at the table before any deal get done. And so Donald Trump, as is his wont, changed his mind and changed his approach.
Okay.
Bottom line, for this particular 3-hour-long summit, everybody looks like a winner, except for the Ukrainians.
That's the big point. Everyone looks like a winner except Ukraine and Europe. Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, you've served there extensively. Europe was very apprehensive that President Trump may concede, may force Ukraine to cede territory, even though indications were that territory swap or conceding territory would not be a part of the conversation on day one. But your takeaway from the 3-hour-long summit, sir?
Well, my takeaway is on a slightly different note.
Okay.
You know, President Trump's desire to bring the Russia-Ukraine war to an end is linked to his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The Washington Post had commented last month that the road to President Donald Trump's highly coveted Nobel Peace Prize might ultimately run through Ukraine. Now, if you recall, in his inaugural address on January 20 this year, President Trump had said that his proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and a unifier.
Yes.
He has repeatedly said that this is the reputation he wanted recorded in these 3 books. And it's no secret that he covets the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me recall also that last month, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, had told reporters that it's well past time that President Trump was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war's complexity and the deeply entrenched positions of both sides, combined with the potential for shifts in the global political landscape, make ending the conflict a formidable challenge. So, what is Europe's take on this? Europe certainly doesn't want a settlement forced by the United States, and which is entirely against the interests of Ukraine and, in fact, of the whole of Europe. And it's not going to be able to, for President Trump to force a solution. And this is perhaps what has happened. Nothing major, I think, has been achieved. Though, of course, the White House had already tempered the expectations down. They had said it's a sounding out summit. But more than that, I don't think we can expect much from what happened.
Dr. Surva Kamal Datta, would European capitals heave a sigh of relief, or would they be disappointed with several commentators saying President Putin has walked away victorious? He hasn't conceded an inch. There is no ceasefire. The war continues, and he's got the red carpet.
Well, I would say Europe would be doubly cautious now after yesterday's and last night's meeting of President Trump and Vladimir Putin. I understand also that the biggest loser in this first round is actually Ukraine. Ukraine actually did not get what it was expecting. It was expecting an immediate ceasefire. President Trump was so shrill and loud before the meeting, saying that if there is no immediate ceasefire, he will just walk out of the meeting. And after the meeting, he sounded so hollow. So, and that is what the character of President Trump is all about. He keeps on fluctuating. He keeps on deviating from whatever he says. But the biggest winner out here, in my understanding, is like hats off to Russian diplomacy, as well as to President Vladimir Putin. He has personally won the first round. He has re-established himself, re-legitimized himself and his presence as a global leader, and especially with the Western Bloc. And what better than United States of America? Second is like in terms of the tariff also, I think President Trump has to give a lot of answers to the global world now after the explicits given by President Putin that, you know, there has been a 20% increase in bilateral trade between United States of America as well as Russia after the new regime came over. So President Trump has to give a lot of answers to China as well as to India and other countries on whom he has imposed sanctions because of bilateral trade with
Well,
Russia.
he's threatened 25% additional sanctions on India, chickened out of imposing additional sanctions on China for the next 90 days. But as you very rightly point out, that if there is a bilateral trade, and as President Putin mentioned, 20% it's reached, Professor Latham, this would put America on a sticky wicket because the world is watching this very, very closely. But I'll come to tariffs in just a moment. The meeting in Alaska, the fact that President Putin said we are close neighbors, though separated by the Strait of Bering, no summit for over 4 years, ties were at its lowest since the Cold War, and that's not good. But the point that he raised, Professor Latham, the fundamental threat to Russian security, that needs to be addressed. The people of Ukraine are brotherly, events a tragedy and great pain even for Russia. Is that an indication that Russia is friendly with the people of Ukraine? It's the regime that President Putin wanted to paint in a corner.
I think that's the narrative that President Putin would like the world to buy. And it's not without historical justification. The borders are, as are all European borders, very artificial and product of history, product of war in the past, product in this case of Stalin simply arbitrarily redrawing the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union at one point in the 1950s and taking Crimea out of Russia and putting it in Ukraine quite arbitrarily. So there's that going on here. But there's a slightly bigger picture here as well, which is that the Europeans, I think, are exaggerating the Russian threat. I think after these 3 years of war, the Russian people and the Russian government and the Russian military have had enough. They're exhausted. It's not like they're going to get a ceasefire on their terms, favorable to Russia, in Ukraine, and then turn on Sweden or Poland or the Baltics. It seems inconceivable. And yet this is a very live fear in many European capitals, especially those that border on Russia. So it is a European issue in that respect, although it doesn't need to be. It could be treated as, here's the real problem. There are two issues, one of which is Russia's geopolitical imagination, which always includes Ukraine and Russia in the same political unit. But the other one, which people in Europe have ignored and have refused to face, is that as NATO has crept closer and closer and closer to Russia, Russian security anxieties have gone up and up and up, finally through the roof. And the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was when the U.S. started talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. That is intolerable from a national security perspective from Moscow's viewpoint. And so it's hardly surprising when you put those two things together, this imagined history, let's just call it that, of unity of these two peoples, plus the fear generated by NATO expansion and NATO expansion and NATO expansion. It's hardly surprising that Vladimir Putin lashed out the way he did. Lots of blame to go around here.
Indeed, and we will talk about who should shoulder that responsibility or be blamed for that bogey. President Trump did speak about another bogey. It's that Russian interference in American elections bogey, and he said that hoax kept that relationship from moving forward in his first term. And subsequently, President Putin spoke of the relationship being at its lowest during Biden era, which shouldn't have been. But Ambassador Dayal, before I bring in Rohit into this conversation, one, do you see the relationship move forward, or will there be an intense pushback from Europe and from Ukraine? How do you see Ukraine reacting to this? President Zelensky was, he kept tweeting till very late at night when this conversation was happening. No reaction just as yet. But would he heave a sigh of relief, or would he be very, very worried that he may just be hung out to dry?
As regards Ukraine's reaction, let me state that Zelensky had always totally rejected the idea of making any territorial concessions or ceding any territory. Yes. You'd recall that in a video address after President Trump had announced his forthcoming meeting with Putin, Zelensky had said that Ukraine is also ready to work together with President Trump, but he had vowed that his people will not give up their land to the occupier. And Zelensky had also said that any decisions which are against us, any decisions that are without Ukraine, are also decisions against peace. So he has been very consistent in making clear his opposition to this sort of meeting that was taking place between President Trump and President Putin. And the expectations in Europe were never very high. But of course, there was a degree of concern whether something could be worked out behind their backs. The fact of the matter is that this meeting has made it very clear that bringing about any kind of a ceasefire is going to be very, very difficult.
Dr. Datta, your take on his comments to the American media. As of now, perhaps, maybe, and that's the term he's used, maybe no additional tariffs on India. He's spoken of China, but he's also spoken of India.
Well, I think the 50% tariff on India itself was quite a lot. And I think that's the maximum which United States of America in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic scenario could have afforded to do, and
no, but if I may, Dr. Datta, the additional tariff, is it beyond 50% in your impression, or this 25% tariff is there? The remaining 25% was to come later and not immediately.
Well, the additional 25% is supposed to come at the end of this month. That is the kind of a understanding which Washington had given. But the additional or the secondary tariff which he was talking about, I believe it was more of a hogwash and a kind of a rhetoric at the global level. And in reality, that would not have been feasible for United States of America. The comment which President Trump has given right now saying that, maybe there won't be any additional tariff on India, I think it is something like he's trying to, build up the broken bridges as such. And in my understanding, it's little too late now, because ultimately in international relations, there is no permanent friend, no permanent enemies. What matters is your permanent interest. Very soon, our foreign minister is going to travel to Russia. We will see a lot of things coming out of that meeting. The Chinese foreign minister is visiting India very soon. Yes. There would be a lot of permutation combinations emerging out of that meeting. What I understand is, like United States of America, as history has proved in the past also, cannot be a reliable natural partner of India. US has proved this in the past, and US has once again proved it in no deeper words this time also. President Trump always used to proclaim that he's the biggest friend of India, but in reality, whatever he has done, I think no other president of US in the past has done that. So I think the bridges have been burnt too much, and it is something which is very difficult to repair.
Rohit, the conversation that is happening right now in the United States of America is more about Russia and the United States of America and, of course, Ukraine. So are there those who say that the president tried, but now the ball is entirely in Ukraine's court? And when it comes to tariff, is this furious backpedaling by the United States of America? And what are your sources telling you? Now on the 25th, when the American team is supposed to come to India for the 6th round of talks, is that happening? Is there still on the cards?
So yes, the USTR has not indicated that they're pausing anything. They're going to be proceeding with traveling to India to continue negotiating with India on the trade deal. That's number one. The other thing about, I think President Trump, honestly, in this case, is trying to use every leverage that he had, including putting those additional tariffs of India, to bring a Russian president on the table to negotiate, which he's successfully done. As far as the ball going into Zelensky's court, look, I think it's also shifting some responsibility over to Zelensky. And he's agreed with the Russians. He said that he talked about land. He also talked about NATO. So I think, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, yes, there could be a deal made, and he's not losing any territory. It's Zelensky who's going to lose territory. It's Ukraine. It's NATO. It's European Union. They are the ones with the highest stake into this war. So I think he's also putting them on the spot. He's also advised Zelensky to make a deal. So we'll have to wait and watch what second round becomes of it. Is it going to be one-on-one, or it could be trilateral, as suggested by President Trump?
And the indications are it could well be a trilateral, a bilateral between Russia and Ukraine, with the American president perhaps sitting in on that meeting as a guarantor of peace between the two countries. Will it be like that? We do not know, but that's just intense speculation in the world media right now. But I want a guest to stay with me as I play out two images on your television screen. One, you see this red carpet that's been rolled out for President Putin, and the other is the dressing down. Watch those images from the Oval Office when President Zelensky had visited the White House. Look at that stark difference in the manner in which America treated the two sides, President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia. Listen into that conversation that had taken place at the Oval Office in the White House that time. President Trump, President Zelensky, and J.D. Vance, Vice President, were there, and others. Listen in.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this.
what I'm not
You're in
dictating.
no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're
will-
going to feel very
You will
good.
feel influence.
We're going to feel
I'm-
very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed
From the
yourself
very-
to be in a
from
very
the very
bad position,
beginning
and
of
he
the
happens
war.
to be right about
From the
it.
very beginning of the war.
You're not
Mr.
in a good
Brown,
position.
I was
You don't
saying
have the
that.
cards right now. With us, you start
I'm
having
not playing
cards.
cards.
Right now, you
I'm
don't.
very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think
You're
you-
gambling with World War
What do you-
III.
what do you
You're
think about?
gambling with
What do you
World
think
War
about?
III. And
Yeah.
what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
I'm
That's
with all
back to you.
respect to your
Far
country.
more than a lot of people said
very
they
respect.
should have.
Professor Latham, your appreciation, your take on the difference in the treatment of President Zelensky then and President Putin now.
Well, to be charitable, there's certain lack of diplomacy at play in that February White House meeting on both sides. President Zelensky did not behave well, and nor did J.D. Vance, and nor did Donald Trump. And so it spiraled downwards into a very acrimonious, embarrassing moment on global television. Whereas, and I think, by the way, that happened almost by mistake. J.D. Vance kind of kicked it off, and then Zelensky reacted in a very counterproductive way, and then Trump jumped in with both feet, as he always does. Whereas this summit was more carefully scripted. And President Trump wanted a certain aura around this summit of positivity, of constructiveness, of forward motion, of him being buddies with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. He even used his first name on several of occasions to kind of underscore that. So one spiraled out of control very, very quickly and created a negative vibe, and the other one was so carefully scripted that it left us with a largely positive vibe. When Donald Trump is self-disciplined and on his game, he can pull it off. When he's not self-disciplined, which I'm afraid is most of the time, things can get out of hand very, very quickly.